I'm Don Perreault, and I'm here today at the Chester Historical Society's Museum at the Mill. Over the years, I've looked at the hundreds of artifacts in this museum and the stories that they tell. But there's one artifact that really has always intrigued me, and that is the 1860 list of the eligible voters of the town of Chester. Most people remember this because of the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln arrived in Hartford the evening of March 5th, 1860, and was immediately whisked away to City Hall, where he was introduced by Governor Buckingham to a packed and wildly enthusiastic crowd. The rising political star then proceeded to deliver a 2-hour speech on the slave question, which he called the all-pervading question of the day. His speech began, "Whether we will have it so or not, the slave question is the prevailing question before the nation. Though it may be true, and probably is true, that all parties, actions, and individuals desire it should be settled, it still goes on unsettled, the all-prevailing and all-pervading question of the day." After Hartford, Lincoln went on to speak at New Haven on March 6th, Meriden on March 7th, Norwich on March 9th, and Bridgeport on March 10th. One has to wonder how many of the voters on our list traveled to hear him speak, and just what this list of eligible voters today meant to those living in Chester in 1860. But then there's the more obvious question. The election of 1860 was the final event that triggered the South's decision to leave the Union with the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate as president in 1860. The Democrats were split with Stephen Douglas of Illinois as the party's leading candidate, but Southern Democrats chose their own candidate, John Breckinridge of Kentucky, who was more sympathetic to slavery. Fearing that the Republicans might gain power, a third party, the Constitutional Union Party, formed, comprised of former Whigs, Know-Nothings, and moderate Democrats. This split in the Democratic Party allowed for the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The nation knew the consequences of Lincoln being elected, and those on the voting list must have known the impact their vote would have upon their future. While this might have been reason enough to save such an election list, I often wonder why other towns did not save their list. I believe this list was saved because Chester, like so many other Connecticut towns, had a very conflicted history with slavery, and this is where our story begins. One need only travel back 100 years prior to the 1860 election to see that African Americans were an important part of the economy in many 18th century New England towns. In Chester, we see many prominent names owning slaves in the late 1700s. Gideon Leete, Joel Canfield, Jonathan Warner, Seth Warner, Pascal DeAngelos, stepson of Seth Warner, David Warner, William Mitchell, Abraham Waterhouse, and John Shipman. All of these men were involved in the West Indies trade. We even see Jonathan Warner involved in slave trading, as stated in a ship's manifest of the brig Matilda, which he was part owner in 1797, and it lists slaves as a part of the cargo. The historical record is clear that these men owned slaves who in turn worked in the shipbuilding yard, the saw and grist mill, and worked the farms. The very economy of 18th century Chester was intertwined with African American slavery as West Indies trade picked up in earnest following the French and Indian War in 1763. And this wealth can be seen in the great house built by Jonathan Warner in 1799. And yet Jonathan's grandson, Eli Warner, would see the issue of slavery very differently. Eli was born in 1785 and grew up surrounded by the wealth and trappings of his wealthy grandfather. Eli attended Yale and later Tapping Reeves Law School in Litchfield, Connecticut. The list of students who attended Tapping Reeves Law School include 2 vice presidents of the United States, Aaron Burr and John C. Calhoun, 101 members of the United States House of Representatives, 28 United States senators, 6 United States cabinet secretaries, 3 justices of the United States Supreme Court, 14 state governors, and 13 state Supreme Court Chief Justices. Eli Warner went on to be the Chief Justice of the Middlesex County Court. Eli would live in the Grand Warner House on the corner of Middlesex Avenue and East Kings Highway. Where Eli departed from his wealthy grandfather was in the fact that he abhorred slavery and dedicated his life in the decades prior to the Civil War to the cause of the abolition of slavery. By 1837, Connecticut had 29 anti-slavery societies. On February 28, 1838, Eli Warner was a delegate from Chester to the Anti-Slavery Convention in Hartford representing Middlesex County, along with other Chester abolitionists, Samuel and Garrett Mills, Alexander Johnson, Daniel Auger, Julius Cone, and Samuel Silliman. Along with their neighboring abolitionists, such as George Reed of Deep River, founder of the Pratt, Reed and Company, and Julius Pratt of Essex, son of Phineas Pratt, who invented the first saw for the cutting of ivory, these men worked to bring an end to slavery in a variety of ways. They held anti-slave conferences, published anti-slavery materials, gave anti-slavery speeches, posed legal challenges before the courts. But no greater or more noble to the cause was the abolitionist who served as station masters on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad began during America's colonial period and continued until the end of the Civil War. Not a literal railroad. It provided a series of safe havens, stations per se, where slaves were making their way north to Canada would hide from slave catchers or bounty hunters. As the slaves traveled by night, they were guided by the North Star. During the day, they would be hidden. As they came into Connecticut, they would either travel from the south by ship, mastered by an abolitionist captain, or travel on a land route. Stations would be a private house, barn, or even a church, where the runaways would stay until safe to move on to the next northerly station master. Chester was very active in the Underground Railroad. They would most often come eastward from New Haven and follow the old stage road, Route 80 today, to Deep River or Chester. Judge Eli Warner and his son Jonathan vigorously worked to transport these slaves. At the 1838 Anti-Slavery Convention in Hartford, it was noted that both Eli and his son Jonathan were mentioned as being active in the Underground Railroad between New Haven and Norwich. It is also noted that theirs was one of 3 houses on Kings Highway where food and shelter were provided. Thus, 3 station masters on Kings Highway alone. Did these men act alone? No. The record shows that there were other active abolitionists in town, including Mills, Augers, and Sillimans. And they did not try to hide their intentions. It is noted in the record that the Chester Library in 1839 seemed to have been more abolitionist than library. Eli himself was often asked to speak on numerous topics. We can most likely be certain that on such a topic would have been the anti-slavery crusade. With the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, the abolitionist cause became more active and brazen. Another abolitionist from Chester was Dr. Ambrose Pratt. Born in Deep River in 1814, he attended Yale and the Columbian Medical College in Washington, D.C. His time in Washington would have exposed Ambrose to the Southern institution of slavery. He eventually would move to Chester, purchase a grand house on Middlesex Avenue, and set up his medical practice. He continued practicing medicine until 1861, when, owing to the breaking out of the war, he offered his services to Governor Buckingham as surgeon of a regiment. He was accepted and commissioned as surgeon of the 22nd Regiment. Dr. Pratt also received a commission from the Secretary of War as surgeon of the 83rd Colored Regiment, dated February 6, 1865. He was unable to accept the commission owing to the termination of the war. After the close of his Army service in 1865, Dr. Pratt resumed the practice of medicine in Chester. The Chester Historical Society holds the Civil War papers of Dr. Pratt. The majority of these papers are letters sent home to his wife, and it is these letters that give us insight into the Pratt family's abolitionist leanings. Quote, West Point, Virginia, May 26, 1863. I write today of exploits. I have this day taken to my arms quite a family, a fresh army of contraband. They want to go north. They have all got money and will pay their passage that looks well for them. They are all well clothed and neat. Yorktown, Virginia, June 5th, 1863. My contrabands, as far as I know, all night. Instead of bringing 7 of them then on, or 8 or 9 men, I think, and 4 or 5 women, they are now in Middletown waiting. How they will go, I cannot tell. We'll find plenty of work in Deep River and Chester. It does not appear these freed slaves were being sent through on the Underground Railroad, but rather were being sent north for a new life with the possibility of jobs in Connecticut. Interestingly, the story does not end here. Edward Hungerford was a descendant of our West Indies trader Jonathan Warner and a cousin to Eli. Edward was born in 1827 in Hadline. After many years making his fortune in upstate New York and Michigan, he settled in Chester, the home of his wife. They built a fine home across from the present-day firehouse. Edward was very active in town affairs. President of the Chester Savings Bank, a selectman, represented Chester in the Connecticut General Assembly, and like his Warner cousins, it was his commitment to African Americans that was most noble. It was the decade following the Civil War that Edward invested in land in and around Maitland, Florida. When his son Robert was at Columbia University, his father sent him to Orlando to recover from pneumonia and a bronchial infection while overseeing his father's citrus orchard. It was at this time that Robert became actively involved in helping African Americans in the Orlando area. He worked passionately helping them to get an education as a means of moving their lives forward. 5 years later, in August 1887, Edward Hungerford and other investors would transfer property to establish the town of Eatonville, Florida, the first incorporated African American community in the United States. Then, tragedy struck. When Robert contracted typhoid and died, Edward Hungerford was crushed by the loss of his son. And it was in Florida, where Robert had been so actively involved with the African American community, that he gave land and financial support for the establishment of a school in Eatonville. The Dr. Robert Hungerford Industrial School was opened in 1899. Over the years, the school has changed, becoming a high school in the 1920s and an elementary school today. Today, the Hungerford School's most famous student is Zora Neale Hurston, later a well-known author and leader in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. The spirit and impact of the Hungerfords on Eatonville were felt by many, and not always good. The Hungerfords carry a mythic tale about Edward Hungerford that, while it cannot be corroborated, it bears all the marks of truth. The family tale says that Edward Hungerford, riding the train down from the north, was getting off in Orlando when he observed a large gathering of white men, some of whom he recognized. Suddenly he realized the crowd was hostile. This, he soon realized, was a lynch mob, and he was to be their victim. In an instinctive gesture of survival, Hungerford gave the secret Masonic signal of distress, which any brother Mason is blood sworn to respond to with help. One amongst the crowd jumped up on the platform and turned to the angry mob and said, "We are mistaken. This man is not stopping here, but has brought me a message which I shall deliver." Then, turning to Hungerford, he muttered, "Don't you dare come back." Whether our story is true or not, it speaks to the courage of the Hungerfords, the Warners, the Pratts, and the many other abolitionists who made Chester their home. And now back to our 1860s list of eligible voters of Chester. One only needs to look down at the bottom to see the election results and how Chester voted. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, 150 votes. Stephen Douglas, Democrat, 28. John C. Breckinridge, Southern Democrat, 35. John Bell, Constitutional, 1. This is a testament to Abraham Lincoln and a testament to the abolitionists who made Chester their home. Thank you.